match burns roughly 8 seconds. A life lasts roughly 80 years. Here one moment and gone the next. If you're smart, you'll use that time wisely.
Well, hey everyone, good to be back, and thanks to Pastor Sarah for leading us through this incredible book of Ecclesiastes in the middle. I have the great privilege of taking us to the finish line over these next couple of weeks, and I'm just very grateful that when I was a kid, I had this wide range of interests and involvements. I was the guy who finished up football practice and then ran down to the theater for play practice. And my group of friends also decided to get involved in a program called the Olympics of the Mind. I know it sounds like I was just super cool in high school, and it was really cool. It was kind of a forerunner, this Olympics of the Mind, to the robotics competitions that high schools have now. So back then, each year, teams from all over, from high schools from everywhere, would be given a challenge. And so your team would do your best to solve the challenge and then come together for a big competition with other schools from all around the state. And so one year, the challenge was to build a structure out of balsa wood. And the team whose structure could hold the most weight would win. And so the judges would come in, and one at a time they would put these plates on, and then one, and then another, and these weights, and then another, to see which would best stand up to the increasing amounts of pressure. And on competition day, one after one, all day long, we watched those structures that these teams diligently built crack and break under the weight. These were structures that had been thought about and cared for and carefully designed, and yet one by one, there was no structure that stood till the end. No structure that you looked at and said, well, I guess that one can withstand any weight. You see, over time, and with enough pressure exerted, eventually every structure broke. Now, after the past few weeks of Pastor Sarah walking us through Q's long monologue in the middle of Ecclesiastes, where he pursued experiment after experiment in this lifetime, trying to find some satisfaction under the sun, we come to this moment in chapter 11 when he finally just says, you know what? Eventually the structure is going to break. None of us is going to be left standing in the end. We'll all collapse under the pressure of life eventually. You know, since childhood, you and I have been drawn to happily ever after stories. Like we want it all to come together, to all work out in the end, happily ever after. And movie studios have even regularly changed the endings of books that they're based on because movie audiences demand a satisfying ending. For example, the movie versions of things like Jurassic Park or Forrest Gump or The Notebook, I Am Legend, even Little Mermaid, they were radically altered from their book endings, which were much less storybook. And so today, Q takes us to the very end. He goes all the way to the point of death. And you may say, well, how could there be a happy ending? That there wasn't even much happy stuff in the beginning or middle. But he finds lessons in death. And we get our first glimmer of hope that Q may be finding some resolution to his struggle. And so the title of my message today is How Death Teaches Us to Live. And in chapter 11, verse 7, Q begins an extensive poem that ends the narrative portion of the book before its conclusion, which I'll tackle next week. So you could go to chapter 11 of Ecclesiastes in your Bible or device. And in this section, he uses two verbs. He starts off right in verse 8. He says, rejoice and remember. Rejoice and remember. And he's writing to the young and then to the old. He then takes us to death. Death is coming for all of us, but death can be a terrific teacher about how to live our lives. And so here's my big idea today. Rejoice when you're young and remember when you're old that life is for living. Let's take them in turn. First, look at this idea of rejoicing. So I want you to look at chapter 11, verse 7. He says, light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. Well, 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 we finally have some positivity. Q is seeing the light. You see, up until now, everything under the sun has been pretty dark. But this poem begins with the pronouncement that light is sweet. It's a metaphor of taste. It reminds us of the psalm, taste and see that the Lord is good. He's saying that it's good and it's delightful to be alive. You know those days when you wake up and everything works Life can be really sweet. Like you wake up 5 minutes before your alarm goes off, your neck feels good, your back isn't stiff, your knees aren't swollen. I mean, that's win number one right there at my stage of life. And you get in the car and the music sounds better and the coffee tastes better and you're singing in the shower. You just want to roll the windows down and feel the warm breeze in your face. Q is saying there are days when life is unbelievably sweet and the sun feels good on your skin. You have a moment of clarity and life is deep and good and you love it. Well, look at verse 8. He says, so if a person lives many years, let him rejoice in them all. We're thinking, man, this is great. Q has really changed his tone. Not so fast. He says, but let him remember that the days of darkness will be many. All that comes is vanity. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and the sight of your eyes. But know that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. Remove vexation from your heart and put away pain from your body, for youth and the dawn of life are vanity. And so here's the first thing I want you to see today. The teacher says, when you are young, urgently rejoice. Enjoy your life. Live for God. Have a blast. Q doesn't chide the young person in these verses for being young. He instructs them. He says, you're young, but don't forget, you'll one day be old. No, he's saying you're young, so make the most of it with every fiber of your being. In verse 9, he says, rejoice, O young man, in your youth. You're commanded to rejoice. Did you know that God commands joy and happiness and delight? These are not optional extras for the Christian. Enjoyment is a command. Were you aware of this? God is not a cosmic killjoy. He's not up there waiting for the next tragedy to come and then being like, see, I told you, you guys shouldn't have misbehaved. No, that's how a lot of people view God. But God is the happiest being in the universe. That should do something to us. Jesus said in John 15:11, I want my joy to be in you. I want my joy to be in you so your joy might be complete. Now, that makes a statement about the kind of a person that Jesus was. Some people think of Jesus as this somber, unsmiling person. But listen, that kind of a person doesn't say, I want my joy to be in you, to your best friends. Like if they think of you as an overly serious person, they're not going to get that thing. And in fact, joy is a topic that's mentioned in the Bible over 650 times. It says joy and rejoice and rejoicing and glad and gladness and delight. Psalm 5:11 says God wants us to rejoice, shout for joy, and be joyful in him. Psalm 43:4, the psalmist calls God his exceeding joy. Job 8:21, joy is mentioned throughout this book of Job, but God promises Job that he will fill his mouth with laughter and with shouts of joy. And so I'm afraid that many Christians have lost a sense of joy, and many churches could post Galatians 4:15 on their walls as a life verse for the church, where Paul says, what happened to your joy? And so I want you to ponder a question today. What is the happiest day of your life? What's the greatest day that you've ever had? What's the best 24-hour unit of time that you've ever experienced since you've been on the planet? What would you say it was? Now, let me help you think it through, because there have been some extraordinary days in your life. There was the day you were born, the day when the clock of your life started ticking and you sucked in your first lungful of breath. And the whole adventure, the whole miracle of your existence began. That's an amazing day. There was a day you took your first step. You were immobile and then you're mobile. You were a walker and your world was never the same. There was a day you spoke your first word. And from that day on, you were a talker. Some of you started talking on that day and you haven't come up for air since. There was a day you learned how to read a book and whole new worlds opened up to you that day. There was a day that you got your first job, the first time you got a paycheck with your name on it. There was a day when you made your first friend. There's a day you went on your first date. There was a day that you fell in love. Maybe a day that your child was born, or the day that you met Jesus, or discovered your giftedness, or experienced forgiveness. You know what I've tried to embrace? I've tried to embrace this idea that the happiest day of my life is this day right here. It's today. The greatest day of your life is right now. Not that this day is going to be pleasant or easy or pain-free, because maybe it won't. But do you know why it's the greatest one? Because it's the only one you've got. Every other day that's gone before is irretrievably gone, and it will not come back. And there are people who spend their whole lives regretting something that happened back on one of those days, or wishing that one of those days could come back around again. And all the days that are coming in the future that are going to follow it, they're off in the future someplace. There are people who spend their whole lives waiting for what they think might happen on one of those days, or worrying about something that they're afraid is going to happen on one of those days. And if you live there, you're going to lose your joy too. But this day, this square right here on the calendar, this is God's gift to you. This is the day that counts, because if you're going to meet with God at all, it'll have to be on this day right here. That's why the psalmist says these words. He says, "This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." It doesn't say yesterday was the day that the Lord made. That was a good day, wasn't it? No. It doesn't say tomorrow is the day that the Lord's going to make. We're going to be glad and rejoice when tomorrow gets here. No, he says it's this day. Don't put off your rejoicing. Now, Q is certainly not encouraging you to go crazy, to do stupid things, to make loose and licentious decisions. He reminds us in verse 9 that God is still the judge. But the thing that will bring you joy, your want-tos, he's saying, do them. Like if you're saying, I want to be a godly man, or I want to be a godly woman, or I want to read the Bible more, or I want to be a good example to my younger brother, or I want to do well in school, or I want to invest hard in my marriage. A lot of people just keep those things as want-tos. And if you don't act on them, your want-tos will eventually become, I wish I would haves. You have this one life to become all that Christ put into your heart, and so do it. Then in verse 10, he says, remove vexation from your heart. We're about to go into a section that's going to have people in the second half of their lives nodding along with them, and those who are under 35 or so feeling confused. But he introduces it right here in verse 10. He's saying, deal with your junk when you're young. It's the same advice you'll get from financial advisors, for example. They'll say, as soon as you can, pay off your debt. Get rid of it as quickly as you can, because interest will eat you alive. But compound interest is your friend. So as soon as you can put money into things that will accrue interest over time, do it. If you can do it in your 20s, don't wait till your 50s. An investment early will really pay off later. He's saying the same thing about all your junk in life. It's going to compound as you get older. So in other words, if it's bad when you're young, it's going to compound when you're old. And if it's good when you're young, it's going to compound when you're old. And so you might as well deal with the bad and start socking away the good. Listen, there are 20-year-olds here right now who are just being eaten alive with lust. And no matter how hard I plead with you, your pride isn't going to let you listen. You're going to do what you please. And it's not going to fully hit you until your first marriage disintegrates. And there's some of you chasing around after greed, like you don't give, you don't save, you just spend every cent on yourself. And you're going to come to a day 20 or 30 years from now when your heart is the size of a shriveled up raisin. And you've burned through a bunch of relationships that could have transformed your soul because you were chasing a bottom line. And I can yell and scream and plead and quote verse after verse to you, but in the pride of your youth, you're just going to go ahead and do it anyway. And Q's like, let's work through that now before it ruins your life. Remove vexation and put away pain, but urgently rejoice when you're young. Life is good. You know, these days my heart goes out so much to our young people. I know so many of you guys have been struggling with a sense of sadness and even anxiety and depression. I'm not pretending that those things come with a light switch that you can just turn off. I realize it's deeper than that. But I want to say something to our young folks. Like if you're in junior high or high school, if you're a 20-something, I want to urge you to practice being happy. Incorporate some practices into your life that will help you to rejoice on a regular basis and to appreciate the life that you've been given by God. Find some simple practices that will help you to do that. Like make a short list every day of 3 to 5 things that you're grateful for before you go to bed each night or right when you wake up in the morning. Or be intentional about visiting a friend or a mentor or an older person who can bring you joy and perspective. Like visit once a week or once a month. Make it a habit. Same day, same time. Don't miss it. Or just decide that every person you pass on the street or at the beach or at your job or wherever you are, that for every person you walk by, you're going to make eye contact with them and say hello and share a smile. Or compliment a person in your life every day. Be intentional about it. Prepare for it. Or take a walk in nature, visit the library, look at the clouds for a long time, learn a new hobby, handwrite a poem or a song or a psalm as a prayer to God. Scroll through your phone and heart the pictures on your camera roll that really make you happy, or create an album in your photos that's just called Joy and add to it often and scroll through it as needed. But practice being happy. And listen, if you're really struggling with depression or anxiety, these things aren't going to do it. You're going to need to get some help, some professional help. We just laid to rest one of our precious young people. Guys, I would just urge you, keep getting all the help you need if you're in a serious spot. You're a gift. The Lord made you today, and it is a gift. And the Lord made you young, and that too is a gift. And so let's all get better at rejoicing. I'm not saying put your head in the sand and all the bad stuff will go away. No, it won't. But enjoy your youth. I like how Paul says it in Philippians 4:8. He says, whatever's true, whatever's noble, whatever's right, whatever's pure, whatever's lovely, whatever's admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. And then if you do it, he says, the God of peace will be with you. While you're young, rejoice. Seek the Lord in your youth. Now, as we round our way into chapter 12, Q makes this transitional statement as he turns his attention to, shall we say, the more mature. He says this, he says, remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near, which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. He says, the older we get, the days get more difficult. The passing of time sneaks up on us, doesn't it? Terry Pratchett says this, he says, inside every old person is a young person wondering what happened. We reach an age where we're left blinking at the speed of life, and we experience this disconnect between the mirror and the mind. The mirror tells us that we're older, but the mind still feels young. And it doesn't make sense to young folks, but trust me, this is what happens. And Q says getting older helps us to see what's most important. I think about Steve Jobs living in his last days with terminal cancer. He said, remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Almost everything. All external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. I said there are two key words in this section, rejoice and remember. We've already said that when you're young, urgently rejoice, but now the teacher says, when you're old, remember that life is for living. As chapter 12:1 says, that the challenge is to remember our Creator during the days while we still have breath. Remember God during the activity of our lives. Remember God in your words. Remember God in your actions. Remember God in your decisions. Remember God in your workplace. Remember God in your home. Remember God in your school. Remember God in the midst of your fears and in your trials and in your temptations. Remember God in your relationships. Remember God in your private moments. Remember that you serve a living and active and participating God who cares about what you're doing with your life. Now, in the next 6 verses, Q describes in detail the process of aging in rich symbolic language. And there are 2 common interpretations to this section. I'm going to walk through the one that I think is most likely, but then I'll come back and do a kind of a flyover with the other one. Most likely he's describing in symbolic language what it's like for the body to get old. And it may be a little humor even, a little tongue-in-cheek even. Like we said in week 1, maybe some sarcasm. So look at chapter 12, verse 2. He says, before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened and the clouds return after the rain. This darkness or gathering of clouds seems to be language pointing to the fading mental faculties and other senses that come with old age. The reasoning power of the brain, perhaps the greatest gift that God has given us, begins to lose its ability and the memory fades. That's one of the first marks of old age. I was asking my dear friend Bernie this week, he's an octogenarian, if this is really true, if the mind really does start to go first. And he told me that there are 3 things that indicate the onset of old age. The first is losing the memory, and then he couldn't remember the other 2. I'm kidding. That's what this verse describes. It describes the fading of the memory, the fading of the imagination, like the stars which fade at the approaching dawn. Sorry, Bernie. Look at verse 3. In the day when the keepers of the house tremble, and the strong men are bent, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those who look through the window are dimmed. So the keepers of the house probably refer to the arm and the arms and the hands, by which we defend ourselves if we're attacked. The keepers of the house, which are so useful in maintaining the body. They eventually begin to shake and tremble when old age comes on. The strong men are bent. This is probably a reference to crooked legs. The steps begin to get shorter and shorter as it becomes difficult to walk. It's been well said that one of the signs of the onset of old age is when your knees buckle but your belt won't. Then he speaks of the grinders ceasing because they are few. What do you think that is? Yeah, that's probably the teeth, our capacity to chew things. And then he says the windows are dimmed, refers to the fading eyesight. We can't read stuff. Then in verse 4 he says, and the doors on the street are shut when the sound of the grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low. So the doors of the street shutting is a reference to the diminishing ability to hear. It's why when you walk into your grandparents' living room, they have the TV up at about a volume of a jet engine. but even that being the case, they says they still rise up at the sound of birds. It's referring to this idea of being more easily awakened in the morning. Even the sound of chirping birds outside the window can wake you up. And yet at the same time, the songs are brought low. The ears lose their powers. And you start saying, hey, and speak up and, all that. So next he talks about fears. Verse 5, he says, they're afraid also of what is high, and terrors are in the way. Fear of falling and fear of attack. And the almond tree blossoms. The grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails because man is going to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. So the almond tree blossoms is probably the whitening of the hair that comes with great, great wisdom. I'm getting wiser and wiser these days myself. Desire fails. I'm not going to go into all that, but apparently that happens too. And there are all kinds of little pills on the market to counteract that problem of Ecclesiastes 12:5. But then it all ends with a funeral. Look at verse 6. He says, before the silver cord is snapped, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. So the day of death arrives, and the body will break into like that little balsa wood structure. Finally, it will have held up all the weight and pressure that it could handle, and then it will collapse, and life will be over. And he ends in verse 8 the same way he began. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. All is vanity. Now, I said there was an alternative interpretation. So before I wrap this up, let me enlighten you about that. I'm not going to go back through word for word, but just to give you the gist. The second interpretation of this section is going to appeal more to the doomsday preppers, okay, the end timers. The alternate interpretation suggests that this symbolic language is pointing to the cosmological catastrophe that's coming on the day of the Lord. That the teacher here is not referring to individual death and the breakdown of the human body, but the death of humanity and the breakdown of the entire society. That the darkening sun and the onsetting clouds is the undoing of creation itself. The picture of the hopelessness of life in a formerly vibrant city when the end comes. That the strong men are literally the strongest men in the city who are now trembling. And the grinders are the workers grinding grain in the mill who will be peering out through the windows, watching the destruction of the city with grief and despair. And verse 4 begins the societal breakdowns. The doors of the street will close. Businesses are closing, leading to starvation. There are dangers in traveling. Mourners walk in the street. But listen, with either interpretation, the conclusion is the same. It all ends in death. See, either way, Q is taking you by the hand, and he's gently asking, like the ghost of Christmas future, before that day comes, how then will you live? And he's saying, remember that life is for living. See, the greatest futility of all is a life that has not found the reason for living. Well, what a waste to live your life and never discover why you're here. Like, what a waste to die without learning the secret of true existence. That's the author's conclusion. He began the book with it in verse 2, and he ends here with the same words in verse 8 of chapter 12. He has searched through all of life, and he's reached the same conclusion. When you limit your focus, when you limit your definition of success or failure to only what is happening under the sun, in these years that we have, it's all meaningless. But if you will invest your years on this earth, on the things that will last forever, well, now you've tapped into true meaning. The reality that awaits you on the other side will make the things of this earth under the sun seem silly. Jeff Bezos' yacht looks like a tugboat compared to the future that awaits every believer in Jesus. The sexual exploits of Machine Gun Kelly look boring compared to the transcendence that awaits every believer in Jesus. The power of every world leader looks incredibly weak compared to the fate of the meek who will inherit the earth on the other side of eternity. And so what will you do with your life? To the young, rejoice. To the old, remember. But to all, remember that life is worth living, and the way you live it matters. You know, there are some of you in this room right now that are in the twilight of your lives. You may only have 2 or 5 or 10 years left on this planet. Can I just tell you, finish well. Like, live with no regrets. Put an exclamation point on that story. A story that has the fingerprints of a loving Father all over it. Live out this last season of your life with radical obedience and boldness and a renewed commitment to advance the kingdom of God like you have never done before in your lifetime. Finish with courage and faith and dignity. May we all be able to say the same words as the Apostle Paul as he was limping across the finish line while sitting in a Roman jail, knowing martyrdom was just around the corner, very well aware that the end of his life was quickly approaching. He said with all confidence, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. And to those who are young, live well. Rejoice in your youth. Suck the marrow out of life because you only get one shot at it. And I realize that Q doesn't go, here with the young and with the old, but I'm going to go to it for a minute. There's this weird generational thing that happens. I don't know if you've experienced this, but I remember when I was in middle school, I used to look at all the elementary school kids and be like, oh, those little punks. Then I'd be in high school, and I look at the middle schoolers, and I think, those punks. And then you get to college, and you look back at the high school kids, and they're like, what a bunch of little punks. And then you're in your 20s, and you look at the college kids, and you say, oh, they're so immature. And then in the 40s, you're looking at those punk 20-somethings. And it's funny that there are some of you in your 60s right now looking at me and going, what a punk this kid is. Don't worry, there's a 75-year-old behind you that's saying the same thing about you. And there's a guy in his 90s in the back that just hates everybody. Everybody's a punk. But there's this weird tendency, you see, for us to look down on the next generation. But what if we would work together more? Like, I think everyone is longing for it. Like you older folks, I wonder how much vitality it would return to the last quarter of your life if you started opening your home to some of these younger punks. I mean, golf's great and all. But I wonder how much vitality could be restored to marriages if the generations would collide more. I wonder how much better it would be for our kids. The book of Titus commands older men to seek out and invest in younger men, and older women to invest in younger women, to teach them godliness. It doesn't suggest that, it commands it. What if for those of you who are in your 40s or 50s or 60s who know Jesus and you know the scriptures well, like what if you stayed in your life group that you're currently in, but just for one more night a week, or just every couple weeks, you just opened your home up to some 20 and 30-year-olds to use your home. You don't even have to teach anything. Just sit in the middle of the conversation every once in a while, say, that'll never work. Or just be the guy that says, hey, why don't we just get back to the Bible instead of what we're feeling right now? Like one of the things I always remember from sitting with my brother Dick Page, who's a generation or two up from me, is I'd be swimming in all kind of crazy stuff with the crazy schedules and my kids and the work-life balance and all the stuff. And Dick, who raised 8 daughters, would just kind of chuckle. He would say, this too shall pass. And it was oddly comforting. Like there's wisdom there. This stage of things won't last forever. In fact, that the day is coming where you're going to long for this stage, just a little bit more of that craziness that you had back in that other part of your life. Where you wish you could, strap them in or buckle them up one more time or tuck them in for just once more. We need the generations to collide in some meaningful ways more than they're doing right now. So, Q spoke to the young and to the old, and he told us that death can teach us how to live. And to wrap up today, I just want to do this goofy exercise with you. We've done it before. You've probably seen it before. But I want you to take out your phone on your notes app or take out a piece of paper and a pen from your purse or wherever you might have it. And on the left of the page, I just want you to write the year that you were born. You can carefully shield this from your neighbor if you need to. For me, 1971. Okay, I'll say it loud and proud. 1971. And then write a dash, and then write the numbers 2, 0, and then leave 2 blanks. See, every one of us has one of those dates on the left. We mark that day. We celebrate that day. We eat cake and blow out candles. But every one of us also has one of those days on the right. The blanks just aren't filled in yet. It's the day that you're going to leave this world. It's the year that you're going to depart. We don't like to think about that day. Now, you had no control over that first date. The date that you entered this world was entirely out of your hands. And you have little control over that last date. But we all know it's coming. We don't get to control it, but we know it's coming. And in between your first day on this planet and your last day is a dash. And what that dash looks like is mostly up to you. Whether you're going to be a blessing or a curse to this world is mostly up to you. And into that dash, we have to cram all of our living and loving and growing and stretching and all of our battles and efforts and friendships, all into that little hyphen. And so I ask you this simple question this morning. What will you do with your dash? We all get one, but we get only one. One shot at this thing called life. What are you going to do with yours? I love you guys.